Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Petronerds podcast. This is episode 115 of the Petronerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of Petronerds and the host of the Petronerds podcast. I am super pumped to be with you here today. Today is September 11th, 2024. It is Wednesday. We are seeing some significant deterioration in oil prices, and we have a lot of news to cover. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet. This is now my third attempt at recording this intro because it was way too long. You're going to get a lot of details on within this podcast, within this presentation, which is the keynote presentation I gave to the Independent Petroleum Association of New Mexico. This was just a really, really fantastic group. I was delighted to be asked to give the keynote presentation in the morning at the IPANM conference in Albuquerque, New Mexico in July. This keynote presentation took place on July 12th, 2024. So it's been a couple months. It just was a really, really fun talk to give. I was pretty fired up about elections and what was going on, particularly with the Biden administration and everything that was going on at that time. A lot has changed since then. We have had some real deterioration in oil prices. But this talk and presentation, this is to the Independent Producers Association of New Mexico, or Independent Petroleum Association of New Mexico, IPANM. And this is the keynote presentation that is your soup to nuts coverage of politics, the economy, geopolitics, the wars that are taking place, and the resiliency of U.S. shale. And really, this is the take home, is that this incredible resiliency that you're seeing in the U.S. shale space, particularly in the state of New Mexico, it is not just, the Permian Basin is phenomenal. The Delaware Basin, part of the Permian Basin, those two counties, Lee and Eddy County, which are producing 2 million barrels per day, are absolutely crushing it in New Mexico. But it's also the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. So I go through all of this within this presentation. I can't wait to hear your feedback and for you to take a listen. But with that, we are going to timestamp this and talk about what is actually happening in the market today and the $67.33 WTI that we're seeing, $70.70 Brent. Henry Hub is at 228. We're seeing Dutch TTF at 1168. We've moved down a little bit from that. 30-year mortgage is at 6.42% for 30-year mortgage. That has also moved down. That is right in line with the 10-year yield curve that we are seeing at 3.64%. We've seen some real moves down, some real slide back on the 10-year yield curve. So some real backsliding on the 10-year yield curve, and you're seeing that really just move in lockstep with oil prices. So this deterioration in oil price, obviously, one of the single biggest questions I get from clients is that, what's really happening in oil prices? What's moving the needle here? And, I've told you guys, I've told listeners, I tell clients, those $5 swings, those few dollar swings we see on a daily basis, those are not what worry me. It's that movement, that trajectory downward that's concerning. And that's what we've been talking about for years now on this podcast. And it's what I've been telling clients for years is that, yes, you're not going to get the timing of a recession right, but commodity prices are often telling you something that the stock market or the market is not. And I would say that we are seeing a pretty big sentiment shift in the market and the commentary. Since August, you saw when we saw that yen carry trade, that unwinding, and we saw the unemployment, the jobs number, we saw the Japan increased their interest rates, and we saw all that craziness going on in August. And then that snapback was saying, oh my gosh, that was overdone, not a big deal. But really, if you listen to the economists, a lot of folks really thought that this is really just telling you what's going on. And yes, that craziness and that sell-off probably wasn't warranted, but nor was we're going back to being bullish. And the stock market is one thing, but the economy and oil prices are quite another. And that's why you have to really pay attention to both. And so what you're seeing in oil prices is, the softness is a few things. And so what I want to talk about this in this intro today is the softness in oil prices. What's going on there? What are the macro factors driving it? I want to point out that you're not hearing much about geopolitics and the ongoing hot wars because the stock market and the news and everything is so myopically focused on the elections, and particularly the debate that we had last night between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And today is September 11th. So it was very interesting, the fact that we actually saw them debate last night, and we actually saw them shake hands again today and stand not next to each other, but with Joe Biden in the middle, because for the September 11th commemoration. And I want to talk about the shale paper that I just released. It's on the resiliency of U.S. shale. It was part of the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, their energy forum. It's kind of a quarterly thing that comes out. I've published it on the website. It's a really great short piece just updating you on shale and looking at how productivity curves, looking at how resilient U.S. shale has been really since coming out of COVID, and what's happened in the space, and seeing a dramatic decline in the rig count, and yet the incremental lateral lengths continue to increase. And that's why partly why we've really seen productivity just really, really be maintained. I'm going to go through a lot of that in depth in future podcasts, but I want to point that out. And then I also want to note, I want to talk a little bit about something I'll be talking about in future podcasts as well, but that's the nerdy, awesome BP data that it's formerly BP. It's now the Energy Institute, but I have got that data updated because I'm going through a lot of China data, and I'm looking at Chinese emissions, but we're looking at China coal and looking at Chinese economy. And so I just thought it'd be great to point out the numbers of the US and China, because super, super important when you're thinking about elections and you're thinking about the economy is how people are, what they're actually going to do when it comes to energy, when it comes to electricity, and when it comes to you being able to turn your lights on in your own home, and why that matters so much from an economic perspective. So I'm going to get into that. And then I did this article. So this is my first article. It's sort of a summary and encapsulates a lot of that shale paper, but it's a short version. It's an op-ed. This is an article that's called "America's Energy Success Has Nothing to Do with the Biden-Harris Administration," and it absolutely does not. So this is from Real Clear Energy. This is the first paper I did with the American Energy Institute, AEI. I am their new economist. So it's a really great short piece. I hope you guys take a look. It got great feedback on Real Clear Energy. And the point of it is that the Biden-Harris administration, under the administration, you have seen record oil production, but it really has nothing to do with them. It's all about the ingenuity and what's happening within the shale space of the ability to get more out of the rock and doing a lot more with less, particularly with those longer laterals, and really fracking those wells really well. That's knowledge of the rock, that's an enhanced knowledge, and just incremental increased recovery. So there's that. And then I will be speaking with an awesome panel at the Denver Earth Resources Library on October 3rd. So that is not something you're going to want to miss here in Denver, Colorado. If you haven't signed up, this is the Rockies Expo. So I'm on the board at the Denver Earth Resources Library, and this is a really, really awesome event. It's kind of like a mini NAPE where people come and show assets. But last year I put together an awesome panel, turned it into a podcast. Such a phenomenal group of people, really, really great questions, which is a really awesome event, and a really, really great panel. So this year it's going to be me. It's going to be Lane Weirs, the VP of Field Engineering with Liberty Energy. He's just really, really great person, but an awesome person to talk to about the frac world and the service sector. And also a great friend of mine, and another awesome panelist is Brenton Cheeseman, who's the VP of North America for NCS Multistage. So these are extremely intelligent people. This is going to be a very, very heavy hitting conversation, and absolutely not a panel you want to miss. So even if you don't know about the Denver Earth Resource Library, and you don't know what the Rockies Expo is, get your butt down to the Denver Earth Resources Library on October 3rd, because it is going to be a killer event with killer content, and it's just such a beautiful space, so you can learn all about it. So with that, we're going to get back into really quickly going through what is happening with the softness in oil prices. So why are we seeing this real deterioration? And that is these sell-offs that you're seeing. Obviously, part of that is I want to really point out is the economy, right? Oil prices are telling you that the economy is weaker than the stock market or anybody really wants to tell you. So we are seeing, we know there's continued weakness within China. So I say that because I go through China and I go through the data detailed, and the data is crap. But overwhelmingly, what you are seeing is a trend within the Chinese economy is that there's no way you can have the economic growth that they say they have and that oil demand that they've said they had with the economic growth when their economy is declining and when their housing sector is imploding. So there probably is not yet a bottom in the housing sector. We don't see the Chinese government actually going in and stimulating the economy. And so you still have real concerns in China about outright deflation. So that the consumer is spending on some things, but not other things. And so when the consumer is not spending in China, it's because they don't have jobs and they don't have money, and they're very, very concerned about the economy. They're not putting their money in the stock market. The stock market just keeps tanking because stock market isn't real. These are like pretty fictitious valuations. They don't have SEC filings. They don't have the kind of transparency that we do. It's, I would say, for all intents and purposes, it's kind of fake. You don't invest in Chinese stock market for the long term. This is just a betting, gambling. stuff I've talked about before. The housing sector, though, is really serious because that is a good chunk of the economy. There was a stat I heard the other day, and this was from actually 2014, because I've been going back and looking at old stuff on the Chinese economy. And, there was a number I heard, and it was like 60% of the economy at the time was investment, where 30%, and there's another 10% that's other things, about 30% was consumption. And so Xi Jinping and the dual circulation and this whole drive to switch up the economy and get the consumer to spend, I'm not, well, one, I'm not certain that's what they actually want. That's what they said they wanted. It's not working, for one. But two, if you get the consumer to spend and you get the consumer to do all this stuff, you can't do that unless you have a healthy economy. And you're not going to, if you do that, then that you don't have that money in the bank to use. So I think there's a lot of things that China's doing from that we need to appreciate, that the government actually wants to slow down the economy. So if the government wanted to stimulate, they would increase debt massively, and that's a problem, but they could stimulate like they have before. And that they're choosing not to do that says, one, they're choosing not to do that, but two, they might not be able to, and three, they may kind of want this downturn. And I say that what it's really important to think about, that weakness in China and that continued weakness, is that we've known about it. It's just kind of something that's getting finally talked about. So the International Energy Agency talks about the weakness in demand. We'll see that information and data actually out tomorrow. But the IEA says it, and now OPEC for the second month in a row. Yesterday, they came out and lowered their demand a little bit, not a ton, but they lowered their demand outlook. And OPEC was supposed to come back now and say that they're going to start increasing their barrels. They are holding that offline because OPEC is producing 26 million barrels per day, just over 26 and change million barrels per day. We are producing half of OPEC production right now. That is a really, really serious thing, because you're seeing the Saudi Arabia only produce under 9 million barrels per day right now. So part of why oil prices, you have this softness in China, weakness in China, ongoing weakness in China. You have spare capacity. I cannot underscore or underline that spare capacity piece enough. We have, so you can think about crude oil inventories, and a lot of folks like to talk about that. Oil on the water. You can look at what IEA shows. You can look at the short-term energy outlook here in the U.S. and see that we are low on traditional OECD crude oil inventories. However, we're very, very high in spare capacity. So I think it's part of the market, right? We're high on production, we're high on spare capacity, and we have a weakening economy. So it's not outright weak, it's just weakening, and therefore you don't probably need all those stocks. So that's just a component. And then you have a weaker U.S. consumer. I've talked about this at length in previous podcasts. I talked about within this keynote presentation that I gave in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So you're going to hear a lot about the U.S. consumer. But you are hearing more and more, I think, a deterioration. The sentiment that you're hearing on the stock market, people coming out, yes, you still have the bulls, but you're hearing more and more weakness. Alipay, whether it's a beige book, people talking about delinquencies going up. You're just hearing concerns about the consumer that's just not there. When Walmart is just going gangbusters, that's telling you that everyone's shopping at Walmart for a reason. And so there's a kind of everybody in the stock market, whether you're listening to Bloomberg or CNBC, people always talk about the haves and have-nots. I think I hear a lot of that on the Tom Keene on Bloomberg Surveillance always talks about the haves and the have-nots. But, something is that, there is haves and have-nots, and there's also things in the economy that have sort of allowed a longer sustained economy and more spending than people expected, which is people borrowed on their housing. They borrowed at low interest rates, and they had all this money to actually spend. And they maybe put that in stock market. They maybe put that in savings. You could have actually borrowed money on your house and then just put that in a CD and then make more interest on that than you're paying. It's not much, but you're still actually profitable in that respect. So there's a lot of different things that were happening in the economy, but I think what you're really seeing is the people that are living paycheck to paycheck. And I say that, and this is not the people that are working at McDonald's, just the people who are working at McDonald's. This is families that otherwise were saving before they had all this inflation, and now they're not. So we had the inflation data come out today. It did actually come in higher than expected. It was up 0.2%. And the problem is that it's not that the percentage of inflation is still 10%. It's that inflation is still upticking, and we had so much inflation before. So we have the consumer is still dealing with very, very high prices at the grocery store. And these are prices that are 50%. I mean, if you just compare what your prices were when you look on Amazon, it is really sad to look at prices that you paid in 2019 or 2020 or even 2021 and what you're paying now. Things are double. So at the grocery store, you've seen often at least a 50% to not sometimes a doubling increase. And you've also seen that shrinkflation where your box of goldfish has actually shrunk and your cereal boxes have shrunk and the prices have just escalated. So what you're seeing is that the consumer is tapped out because those prices haven't come down and their wages haven't gone up. But more importantly, now is that unemployment is ticking up. So I've talked about this weakness in the consumer and inflation at length. But what we saw in the inflation today was that is shelter prices are up. So I've talked about electricity prices being up. That's still really, really serious. That's up. I took a quick look at the inflation read. So services are still way up. So you're still seeing almost 5% on service cost inflation, but it's shelter. Shelter had come down. It was still at 5%, and now it's upticked. So shelter is one of the stickiest, most important pieces because that's housing. And you can strip out food and you can strip out energy and strip out housing. But at the end of the day, well, then you don't have anything in the basket of inflation. So that's why the Fed probably, the concerns or the thinking that they were going to go 50 basis points, and now they're thinking they're probably going to go 25 basis points. And what you saw in the sell-off in the stock market this morning, that was because of it. And I think the weakness in oil prices is reflecting that weakness that people are feeling in the economy. You're having a lot of bets being pulled off on oil, saying that people are betting that the economy is going to deteriorate. So, and there's also a lot of concerns and volatility with the elections and with the economic trajectory for the U.S. for what the outlook's going to be and where the economy is actually going to go. But that weakness on the consumer, there is also a correlation with unemployment. And I want to tease out a little bit in terms of what unemployment looks like. So we are at 4.2% for unemployment. So we are upticking the unemployment. And that should be a concern. And that's why a lot of folks, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, yeah, rah, the Fed's going to lower rates and the market's going to boom. But the reason the Fed's lowering rates is because unemployment's upticking. They may get a soft landing. It's hard to stick that landing. They have to land the plane at some point, and we're kind of landing, and it doesn't look super great. So 4.2% unemployment. 4.2% unemployment. That's an uptick. So we had that crazy sell-off in the yen carry trade and everything happening in August from Japan raising those interest rates, and then the unemployment and the jobs data and everybody freaking out. Now we're back and we're looking at unemployment. We've upticked to 4.2%. There's not massive concern on there, but you couple that with some sticky inflation, and the unemployment piece, it does correlate with a consumer that is weaker, that feels weaker. And so what we did see is that consumers actually in the consumer expectation data they don't think inflation is going to go up wildly, but they don't think it's coming down drastically either. And so that's really serious. But we also see usually in consumer sentiment, there is a correlation between how good the consumer feels and the economy, how good they feel about the economy and unemployment. And as unemployment ticks up, the consumer doesn't feel as good. And that's not because they look at the unemployment and say, oh my gosh, 4.2%, that doesn't look good. I feel horrible. They actually look at it and say it's not looking at it. It's what they're actually seeing and feeling in the economy. It's that knowing people that are losing their jobs or not feeling good about their job or not getting pay raises or not feeling. Think about the ability if you could quit your job now and go get another job. And I say this in the oil and gas industry because I know people that make great money in oil and gas. And I do not think the ability for them to replicate that the ability, if they were to lose that job, to get that money in another job would be very, very difficult, especially right now in this economy. It's just very hard to go and look for a job that's paying, there are not a ton of jobs out there that are paying $200,000 a year. They just don't exist. And so I think that's what you have to really appreciate is that, and that's a great salary. $100,000 is a great salary. But what I'm saying is that those jobs, those high paying jobs that really drive growth and spending, they're not really out there. And so you are seeing companies like Intel cutting 15,000 jobs. And that's really serious because companies like Intel are the ones that were given money to make chips, which they haven't done yet, because a lot of the policies that were implemented on them are the onerous things that they had to pay for daycare and all kinds of things. And the fact that they're cutting jobs and they're the ones that were getting the money that the government was giving to them really does not speak well to these policies. So we do have a deterioration in the consumer. We do have a deterioration in the U.S. economy. That being said, the U.S. economy is in a better shape than probably other economies, but there's some real deterioration. And I think that's what's really weighing on oil prices. That's probably a bigger, there's more weight on oil prices than we're realizing. If the fact that we have $67.33 oil prices right now, and we have a hurricane near the Gulf Coast, or we've had hurricane issues, and we have ongoing war. So we have Ukraine has, they call it an incursion into Russia. They're still going on with this incursion. I've recently got up to speed with that, and I will talk about that more in another podcast because I talked about that a little bit in the last intro. But that was a big gamble by Zelensky to go into Russia. And has that worked? Has it not worked? I mean, it worked to the extent that it worked effectively, and he did boost morale, which was great. But now he's got a situation in Ukraine where he's got a war. He's got troops within Russia. He's attacking Russia, and he's looking for a bargaining chip, right? He's looking to bring Russia to the table to actually have a ceasefire and end this war. And it was interesting in the debate last night because they were talking about Ukraine winning or ending this war. And I think what Zelensky's doing is trying to end the war as well. And that's because the sentiment on the ground within Ukraine, to my understanding, or what I hear from BBC and others, is that the people of Ukraine want the war to end. And up until he did this incursion within Russia, the morale actually of the troops was really poor too. And it's not because they don't want to win and they're not fighting. It's because they don't know where they're going or is there an end in sight to this war. And so it really did help boost the morale and the sentiment around the troops and the ability to say, let's keep fighting, let's keep going. And so that was important, and he needed to do that. But now he's in a situation where Russia just pulled their troops out of that area and kind of just gave it to Zelensky, and it's, like, hey, that's it. And then Russia came back and doubled down within Ukraine. And because Ukraine had put all their best troops up there, now they have a problem. And so Russia's just continuing to pummel their infrastructure, particularly energy, because that also hits morale. When you do not have power generation 24/7, that completely destabilizes not just morale, but an economy. That means you cannot buy food and put it in your fridge because you're not going to keep it cold for 24 hours. So these are really, really serious things. And this is where I say war comes back to energy every damn time. So now we have this ongoing war. And then we have continuing stuff going on within the Red Sea. Houthis continuing to attack these ships. The only people that can move stuff into the Red Sea are Chinese. And then you have this ongoing war within Gaza that was talked about in the debate last night as well. And I'm not sure you can have have the two-state solution and solve the Palestinian issue, and also solve the Israeli issue, because they're being attacked on every front. I really appreciate that Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah are all notified as terrorist organizations, but solving the issue is just not as easy as it looks, or it would have been done already. So that's an ongoing situation, and a really serious in terms of escalation. And so what you have to do to actually solve that, and what Donald Trump did not explain clearly, was how you actually solve this is you sanction Iran. So you can sanction Iran because you have all this spare capacity. If the economy is deteriorating, great time to actually sanction Iran. Because if you're having a backsliding in oil prices, if you want to pump up oil prices a little bit, just sanction Iran. And because you're going to take oil and enforce the sanctions. We had sanctions on Iran. They weren't getting as much revenue. That's actual fact. Their production was down. Their exports were down. Now their production is up. They're well over 3.3 million barrels a day of production, and they're exporting over 2 million barrels a day of that almost exclusively to China. So if you enforce the sanctions and say, China, you're not going to get that crude, that's kind of multiple benefits right there, where China doesn't get the crude, and so they'll get it from Russia. But we prevent Iran from getting all that money. But the fact that we have that ongoing right now, and we have $67 oil and $70 Brent, tells you that there's some real weakness within the economy, some serious, serious weakness, that people don't have transparency and access to the data within China. They're stockpiling. They're at 17 million barrels a day demand, so-called. A lot of that stockpiling. And so what we're really seeing is that deterioration. And we have all this hot wars and massive geopolitics and continuing tension within the South China Sea with regards to the Philippines, and still rattle-sabling with Taiwan. So, but today I did think it was very, very impressive. And I think CNBC noted it and everything. I was busy working and had a lunch meeting, so I didn't see it as much. But September 11th, the commemoration of September 11th today, we had Kamala Harris and Donald Trump on either side. You had Bloomberg giving them for the second handshake of their life. They saw each other again, and they were very civil, and they shook their hands. But I think it's really important to point out, and I don't know if I've mentioned this seriously, I say it in this presentation, why I think that this election is about democracy, because of the time when Biden was still running for office, we still don't know who's really running our country, because this man was not effective enough to obviously run a campaign. So if you're not effective enough to run a campaign, I'm not sure how effective you are to actually be running the Oval Office. And right now, what you saw in that picture, and the fact that the media doesn't even talk about it, is a very senile senile looking old man standing in the middle of that photo op on that little video. And no one is commenting about that. And that to me is a really, really serious, there's just a serious bias in the media when there is no criticism of even now of questioning, who's running the country. And I say that not because I'm trying to really be incredibly political. I say that because I don't think there is a inherent sort of bias in the media, but also because there gives a lot of geopolitical openings for adversaries in this time and period. So with that, folks, I really hope you enjoyed this talk and presentation. I had a blast with it. I can't thank the folks at IPANM enough. Sam Shiverick, the team at Buckhorn, they were actually sponsored this keynote presentation, so thank you to them. And please take a listen to the podcast. Please take a listen to previous episodes. But also, I'm going to have Sam Shiverick back on the podcast to talk about the macro, so we'll have Buckhorn back on the podcast. But please take a look at the shale paper. It's on the website. The resiliency in U.S. shale, relentlessly resilient, I call it, as well as the paper, from Real Clear Energy, or the essay or the op-ed I did with Real Clear Energy on America's energy success has nothing to do with Biden-Harris administration. And lastly, what I'm going to add in here before we close is the BP data. So I'm going to be going through this in future podcasts, but I thought this is really important. So when you're thinking about the elections and you're thinking about the grid and you're thinking about your electricity prices and you're thinking about the fight on climate change and CO2 emissions, I want to point out where we're actually at and why this is so important when we're thinking about the U.S. and China, and the fact that when you are decommissioning coal-fired power plants in the U.S., or you are not allowing the growth of power generation for natural gas, you are really stifling the U.S. and our competitiveness. And I say this because when we look at global power generation, so we look at power generation by source, the total power generation for the world is just under 30,000 terawatt hours. So it's 29,925 terawatt hours. That's for the entire globe. Now, China has China's a third of that. So they're 9,456 terawatt hours. So just say 9,500 terawatt hours for China out of the 30,000 of the world. The US is just under 4,500 terawatt hours. So that's power generation. Now, if you break that down and get nerdy about this, and this is important to do, is that if you want to look at where that power is coming from, is that just under 2,000 terawatt hours is coming from natural gas. Under 1,000, so 816 is coming from nuclear, and then 738 terawatt hours are coming from coal. 738 are also coming from renewable, which is primarily wind and solar, and 236 are coming from hydro. The reason that matters is because for natural gas, for the U.S., we have 43% of our grid is coming from natural gas. We have 18% coming from nuclear, 16% from coal, and 16% from renewable. And it's really serious, folks. I've talked about this before. I talked about it in the last podcast with Chris Brown. But when you are decreasing your coal-fired power generation, you're not increasing your natural gas, and you're adding those renewables, you're adding intermittency into your grid. So I would argue that we could be decreasing our emissions much further if we would actually just leave the coal-fired power generation, make it as efficient as possible, potentially carbon capture if that's what you really care about, and increase natural gas-fired power generation and stop with the renewables. The renewables are adding to your costs, they're adding to your intermittency. So you're going to have to add this base load, and that's why we're seeing such dramatically rising costs. I was looking at that percentage increase, and I'm thinking once we sort of clip that 13% of our grid, that's when those prices really started escalating and going from 14 cents a kilowatt hour, dramatically escalating to under the Biden administration to 18 cents a kilowatt hour. But another important thing to point out is that we are 5,130 million tons of CO2 emissions. So 5.1, just put that in your head for CO2 emissions. Global CO2 emissions are 40,418 million tons. So we are 5,000 out of 40,000. Now we're going to talk about China, because China, and this is why this is whack-a-mole with CO2 emissions, we need to stop this ludicrous ridiculousness that we have in electricity, and then we have the war on traditional fuels, on coal, oil, and natural gas, because China is 9,400 terawatt hours for their grid. A third of the world's power generation is coming from China, which means they can make a lot of stuff, including ammunitions, including weapons, which they're actually making for Russia and sending over. That's also helping their economy. But that's a whole nother podcast. They are 12,604 million tons of CO2 emissions. So they are 12,000, and it's a massive, dramatic upclip. So when you're looking at this chart of these CO2 emissions, it's just a steady rise for China. And that's because their grid is 61% coal. But it's not about the percentage. It's about 5,754 terawatt hours are coal. we're not even 5,000 terawatt hours in total. We don't even have that much power generation. They have more coal-fired power generation than we have power generation in total. That is a serious issue when it comes to reliability, when it comes to the ability to make things, when it comes to affordability to actually make things. This is not just about the U.S. economy and the U.S. consumer, which is really important, but it's about national security and economic security. So 5,700 terawatt hours are coming from coal-fired power generation alone in China. And then renewables are 18%. They're 1,668. That is not, a lot of that is not being connected into the grid. A lot of that's not actually being used. And I think that's what you're seeing in the US, why we're having these high costs and this intermittency. In China, the reason you probably wouldn't have to add as much coal if you didn't have so many renewables, they're hoping that when they're running the renewables, they're not using as much coal and then they can stockpile that. But that being said, just thinking about those CO2 emissions, again, I don't think this is the only goal that we should be tackling. I do not think this is the most important pressing issue in the world. I think the hot wars and geopolitics and getting ahead of China are way more important. But that being said, just put this into perspective. We are dramatically declining our CO2 emissions. And that is largely on the back of natural gas-fired power generation. So we are 5,130 million tons of CO2 emissions. That is less than our 1990 levels. So when we're talking about where we're going back to, guys, we've already hit it. 1990 to now, that is well over 30 years. We are already back to pre-1990 levels. And our peak was in 2007. And that is the onset of the shale revolution, baby. And that is when we added natural gas into the grid. And that is not to rip on coal, because I think if we are declining coal and we are adding all this natural gas, we are now feeling the exacerbated effects of natural gas, which is not something we really want. We're feeling the price impacts of natural gas, and we're not having the baseload reliability that helps us get all the benefits of natural gas that we get from when we add that with coal. But when you think about China and just where China's at, and I'm just going to say this and then we will end, is that China is at they were in 1990 at 2,500 million tons of in 1990 level. So 2,500. So that's half of our emissions now. That's where they were in 1990. In 2007, they were 8,078. So in 2007, they were 8,078. In 2007, we were at 6,000. And yet we've been fighting this war, and they've been adding that coal-fired power generation. And we have been looking in places like Colorado to decommission this and to devastate towns, devastate communities, not just for the jobs from the power generation, but for the ability for these homes and communities to turn their lights on, to access energy, and to have affordable energy that powers their businesses and consumption. And I just think that is incredibly important. You can give people tax breaks, you can do everything you want, but if you are not addressing the single biggest core issues that they're paying for, like electricity and their ability to make things, you are not helping the U.S. consumer. So with that, folks, thank you so much. Bye.
Awesome. I am super pumped to be with you here today. And I know that I got a little flack last night because some of you were nervous that you saw me at 11:30 going to my room. But I promised you that I have a lot of high energy, and we have a ton of information and a ton of slides to go through. So at the end, I would like to talk a little bit more about my business, and definitely think you guys should get involved and talk about Petronerds. And I have this awesome t-shirt, which we'll talk about how you get one of those. But we're going to talk about geopolitics, the economy, and energy. And really the reason for this is that energy is the economy. And I know folks like Chris Wright say this, but it's very, very true. Energy is not a segment of the economy. It is the piece of the economy it's the part of it that allows the entire economy to run. It allows every business to run. And right now we have a lot of complexities in the market from a geopolitical standpoint, from a risk standpoint, and everything going on around the world that's impacting oil prices. Today, sorry, my clicker is not moving. There we go. Okay, so today we have, and we need to go back one, sorry, Petronerds podcast. If you are not a listener, you absolutely should be. So a little shout out to Buckhorn and Sam. He was on the podcast. It was phenomenal. It was actually his first podcast, which he didn't say in it, and it was really, really good. And it was good because he's candid. I love talking with private operators because they tell you actually about the market. I love talking with public operators as well. But if you're looking for intel, if you're looking for more than just this talk, you tune into the podcast. And my clients, this is a summarized rundown. Every little snippet of this presentation that we're going to talk about is basically an hour-long, in-depth deep dive. So if you think I'm going through some things too fast, I mean, I am, but I'm trying to give you an overview of all the complexities that are happening. So right now, we have major oil price drivers. This morning, we just had the PPI, the Producer Price Index, come out. That was way, way hotter than yesterday's Consumer Price Index. So you have this big bifurcation going on right now, that if you're trying to follow the oil market, you were largely following the stock market. You were largely listening to the stock market. You're watching CNBC, you're watching Bloomberg, you're reading the Financial Times, you're reading the Wall Street Journal. And that's your Wall Street. And the problem is that that's where the intel's coming from for oil and gas, and that makes sense. But Main Street has a big role to do with oil and gas, particularly in the US. So when we start looking at gasoline demand in the US, diesel demand in the US, because we are 20% of the global market, it matters a whole lot. And that's what I talk about Main Street US, is how well is the US consumer doing. In my opinion, and with all the data, the US consumer is really not doing that well. And that sticky inflation is a big problem. So yesterday you had everybody get on TV and they were super excited because CPI came in 0.1% lower than expected. So everyone went raw and they think the Fed's gonna cut rates. The producer price index, which people don't care about as much, but the Fed does watch, came in much, much harder, 0.5 percentage point higher than people expected. So the point is that we have a lot of inflation out there. All you need to do is go buy something and you will feel that. And the average person in America, especially the people living paycheck to paycheck, matters to them. And that does in turn matter for oil prices down the road. So the biggest things in the drivers, just very quickly, things that are driving prices up and things that are driving prices down. We have a lot of supply on the market. The US producing 13.2 million barrels a day is more than any country in the world. Every month that we are producing a little bit more, we are breaking our own records and we're breaking global records. No country in the world has ever produced this much crude oil. You will not hear that out of the Biden administration, and you won't hear it from very many government officials because they're pretty anti-oil and gas, domestic oil and gas, and kind of anti-oil and gas. We have a lot of supply. We have high supply in Canada. We have basically a lot of supplies that are just non-OPEC supplies. And we have a lot of spare capacity. So we have Saudi Arabia producing 9 million barrels a day while we are producing 13.2. That is not a long-term solution. That's not going to work out probably in the long term. But the point is the things that, the reason we haven't seen $100 oil despite all these wars taking place is because we have a lot of spare capacity and we have a lot of supply in the market, and we have an economy, not just in the US, but around the world, that's kind of backsliding. But the economy, that would pull it down, and then war and all that geopolitical risk, that's the stuff pushing it up. So right now we're seeing 83 WTI, 83 bucks for a barrel. That is a lot. And that is something that the Biden administration is very careful about looking at. They are desperate to lower prices on something. And they are looking at the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They've said it out loud multiple times. They have tapped gasoline stockpiles. They did it over the Memorial Day weekend, and they did it over 4th of July. They are going to do an SPR release, even though they've drained that piggy bank quite a bit, but expect that before the election. We have a lot of volatility that's going to come up to the election, and that is just one of them. So yes, there are things propping up oil prices, but there are a lot of things that can pull it down. So US and European elections, I'll talk about the US elections shortly, but European elections, what we're really seeing is you're knocking out the incumbent. And the reason is because whether you're Labour in the UK and they had a big sweep, or you're looking at France, and that's a bit of a chaotic mayhem, where they looked to have a right sweep, but that didn't happen because they had a coalition of the left that came together and prevented the rights from pulling in. The reason is really it's about inflation and it's about the economy. If you're listening to BBC and they put the mic in front of somebody in France and they say, hey, why are you going right wing? And they say, I don't feel like I'm going that right wing. I just feel like the economy isn't in our control anymore. We have high inflation. We have high crime. They're concerned about immigration as well. So it's the basic things and same things you hear in America. It's happening across the world, happening across the UK. In the UK, the Tories just happen to be in power. That's a long-term mess. I don't think it's going to get any better under Labour. So we talked about the health of the US consumer and the economy. Inflation is a really, really big deal. I cannot underline it and underscore it enough. When people get excited on TV about 0.1%, that means they are making a lot of money, because 0.1% means nothing to the average person at the grocery store, because I'm still paying 40% more at the grocery store than I was in 2019. And until that changes, or I make more money, or I see the economy ripping, I do not feel good. And that is where the average consumer is at. And one of the biggest reasons why inflation is coming down, why people aren't buying things, is because inflation is too damn hot. So the Fed has raised interest rates, but it is not high interest rates that have actually curbed consumption. It is high prices that have curbed consumption. And that is something the Fed has gotten really, really wrong. So I say this non-recession recession. And I like using these words because I talk about the non-energy transition as well. So we have to get real on ESG. Green tech, clean tech, it is not ESG friendly, meaning it is not environmentally friendly, it is not socially friendly, and it is not governance friendly. Almost all of our clean tech is coming from China and China alone. That's solar panels, that's wind turbines, that's electric vehicles, that's batteries. That is made from coal. So we are just playing whack-a-mole with global CO2 emissions. We're just moving them outside of here, and we're giving them to China, and we're giving China a bunch of money. China doesn't like us. The inevitability of conflict with China just goes up exponentially every year. Between now and the election, because we have all this US volatility and nobody actually knows who is running the White House and who's in charge, expect geopolitical volatility, expect more risk, expect China, Russia, Iran, North Korea to push the envelope a little bit. I mean, we have seen over this administration the fact that when Biden came into office, the administration desperately wanted to increase output or lift sanctions on Iran. So we have sanctions on Iran, but they have meant jack because Iran has exported a significant amount of barrels to China, which has essentially funded Iran and allowed Iran to fund all these little proxy fund organizations. And I say that I'm being flippant here. Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, that's all being funded by Iran, which in turn is really being funded by China. So expect that to continue. So war, energy, geopolitics, Israel and the Middle East, this war that we currently have in the Middle East, that's nowhere ending. We have no end in sight to that war. We have ongoing tensions and actually escalations and ships being attacked within the Red Sea. That's really inflationary. So we're starting to see that where we actually hear shipping companies telling Walmart, telling Target that they're going to have to purchase their Christmas goods now. And there's real risk to that because Walmart might not want to purchase all those Christmas goods right now because what if they don't sell or what if the economy backslides? But that's what's happening because those ships have to now go around the Cape of Good Hope. They have to go around Africa instead of going through the Suez Canal, and that's basically doubling their time. That's helping prop up oil prices, and that's putting a lot of risk to actually goods movement and goods inflation. And then I do want to mention especially on the economy and this non-energy transition. AI, everybody's talking about AI. I don't hear people really explaining in depth exactly what it is and where's the demand coming from. But we do know that the prognostications and the actual demand coming from energy to actually fuel these centers, the AI centers, is very serious. And almost all of the current AI, the artificial intelligence centers in these places they're being powered by natural gas. So they're trying to direct line into a natural gas, and they're all being backed up by diesel power generation. And so that's why you see utility stocks up massively this year, is because everybody's betting on all these segments within AI. But that's a big one, and the reality is that if you are a state that is pushing your green agenda really hard, like Colorado, you are not going to be competitive. If you want an AI facility built in your state, you better not have a crap ton of wind, solar, and renewables because your electricity prices are going through the roof. China's economy is absolutely backsliding. We know that. But within this energy and CO2 space, I told you the whack-a-mole with CO2, they are definitely, what they're doing with EVs and solar and green tech, it's both genius and desperation. It's desperation in the sense that they're trying to offset their economy and they're flooding the global market with all this cheap green tech. And it's genius in that, right now they play a long game. And right now it's not, it hurts GM, it hurts Ford, but really if they can just keep pumping these all this crappy tech into our grid, one, that weakens us. We already have higher electricity prices, but two, from an actual industrial standpoint, it weakens companies like Ford, it weakens companies like GM, and in the future those companies can be very impactful, not just from a competition standpoint, but also from a war and military standpoint. And then I'm going to close this presentation by being very positive and talking about U.S. shale, what you guys are doing in New Mexico. I've had the privilege of talking with a lot of you over the last couple days. I love small companies. I love operators. I am not going to get time in this presentation to get really nerdy and in the weeds on completions, but trust me, I love to do that. But you've done amazing things here. But what you've done here in New Mexico really has to be explained to the rest of the world, and the fact that 2 million barrels a day in New Mexico is a crap ton of oil and gas production, and that needs to be articulated and funneled up onto the national level. And lastly, I'm just going to say, despite all that goodness within this industry, we are not doing a great job. We need to do a much, much better job. There's nobody that's going to defend this industry except this industry. And what you've seen in the past several years is a lot of tailwinds from the Biden administration, a lot of tailwinds from the energy transition and green tech, which is fading. But you see the industry, the oil and gas industry, leaning into that. And that is problematic because it's resulted in very poor market coverage and understanding of oil and gas, which is within the stock market, a lack of leadership in the oil and gas space. There's great CEOs in this room. I'm not discrediting that, but there are plenty of CEOs CEOs that pander, and we have a very anti-oil and gas administration. This is the most anti-domestic oil and gas administration we've ever had in the US, and we are producing 13.2 million barrels per day. It's just not compatible. So with that, I just want to say the knowledge and investment, and I can't drill this home enough. U.S. shale is currently hurt more, and I truly believe this, more by a lack of conviction from industry leaders, and I'm talking about big ones on TV all the time, and market participants than by a potential downside price in oil. The generalist investor, the retail investor, and the broader market is still discounting oil because they do not understand the current, medium, and long-term place in the global economy. So the market doesn't understand where oil fits in the global economy right now, in the medium term, and in the future. And that is why you see share price performance not reflecting reality or not reflecting what it should be given we have $83 oil. So companies need to do a better job, and people like me need to be on CNBC and talking about this because you don't have hardly anybody doing oil and gas coverage the way they used to. And so you have this knowledge deficit that has to be solved for in order for multiples and share price performance to be reflective of oil prices and value. And then it is needed for, this is really, really needed for private companies and for smaller companies and for the service sector to actually just do business, for them to raise capital. I work with private companies all the time and know they don't have the same burdens as a public company, but they still have to raise money and they still get all the questions about the macro and the global environment and how oil prices work and what is the investment thesis. And so it matters for everyone. So with that, now we can dive in. Sorry, we're having trouble on the, there we go. Okay. So we had this debate. This has changed in the past few weeks. If you saw it, I went through and watched half of it. I was actually working on a paper. It was really bad, and it was really bad largely from the optics standpoint. This is not anything new. Any of us who, I do not watch CNN, I do not watch Fox, I watch Bloomberg, I watch BBC, and I watch CNBC. Not because they're not biased, but just because I want information and then I go find the primary sources. But I did watch this debate. I got through halfway through it, and it's pretty bad, largely because I screenshotted that image. And when we talk about what the world is seeing, that is what they're seeing. And that is why you see the Democratic Party in chaos right now, because they're very concerned with what this looks like. I listened to the press conference that Biden had last night before I went to the reception. He did very good in terms of things talking long at length about foreign policy, but he had a lot of gaffes, he trailed off, and he's not with it. We have all known that. I've been talking about this for a long time. I am not being critical of the presidential office. I'm critical of a lot of things Biden has done, absolutely crap ton. And I think it's really, really important for this industry. There is this administration, we have not had a more anti-oil and gas administration ever. And that started with the Climate Change Executive Order 14008 within weeks of him coming into office. And you guys in New Mexico know more than anyone that on day one, they signed an order that was not legal, but put in an order from the acting Secretary of Interior to ban all permits for 2 months. Now, if you don't think expect that to continue, because what you're hearing from the Biden administration is that the defense for Biden right now is that he has a really great team. And so it's not just Biden, it's the team. That's not what he says on TV. He says, I. If you actually watch the interview that he did, I encourage everyone to watch the interview. It was 22 minutes. It was on ABC. Very, very good interview because it really shows the capacity that we're in big trouble here. And so when people talk about this being about democracy, hell right. It is about democracy, and the fact that I don't know who's running my country right now is a pretty big deal. And I say that, and I put this out to you not to be political, but to say the rest of the world is watching that. And the rest of the world understands also that they don't know who's in charge. And so that geopolitical volatility, if you're watching the stock market, you're actually hearing people talk about that the geopolitical risk premium has went up significantly for the summer until we have an election. So there's a lot at stake. Prior to all this, prior to the debate and everything, most of us were watching this. Biden didn't do a lot of Q&A, but we did see a lot coming out of the White House that was very much against the oil and gas industry. And that was the letters that the administration sent to Exxon, sent to Chevron, was telling them to lower their prices at the pump. That's not how the industry works. We know that from when you produce oil to when you get to the refinery to when it's purchased. But that's what the Biden administration did. I do not see the Biden administration sending letters out to the CEO of Excel telling him that he's making $20+ million a year and he's raking in profits like crazy. And I have a $200 a month utility bill. I don't see anger about that because it's political. And this is a big, big problem that we have. So when the industry leans and panders into this administration, I am not a fan because they're not helping themselves. And the industry has to realize no matter how much you say net zero, no matter how much you say energy transition, it's not actually happening in your share price. The thing that's helped your share price more than anything is actually oil prices. And share buybacks, there's probably a role for them, but actually putting the drill bit back into the ground at $83 oil is probably the best thing you can do to get returns. And the Biden administration, this was the New York Times, they talked about the industry having a truce with Biden administration. And then we saw the pause on LNG export permits. And I'm going to show you a couple charts. It is so critical. Most people in DC, most people I talked to, analysts, said that was really no big deal, right? It was just a future thing. It was a very big deal for everyone abroad. It was a very big deal for all the countries importing our liquefied natural gas. It was a very big deal for all the countries in Asia who are building their economies off of natural gas. And now they have to say, oh, well, the US is probably not going to be there in the future, which means I need to go back to coal or I need to go to nuclear. There are big problems with both of those. These Asian countries are going to have to compete directly with China, which is going to be using coal forever, absolutely forever, because it's what they have and it's their energy security. So they're going to have a low-cost fuel. And it would behoove the US to start using deterrence, to start using these carrots, and to put it out there and say, we are going to be there for liquefied natural gas. And if it was about global CO2 emissions, if it was about CO2 emissions, we would be putting as much natural gas into the global system as humanly possible. But we are not. So you know what? I'm going to say it's clearly not about CO2 emissions. So oil and natural gas prices. Today we're sitting 83. The only reason I'm showing you this is because we have had natural gas prices in the doldrums, but that high oil price we have now, that is really a problem when I show you this chart against inflation. We've had these periods of higher oil prices before, but all those periods of high prices, we did not have inflation with that, and now we have both. And that lower period, that lower price of oil where we saw that in the 50s and 60s range, that did not feel good for the industry, but you did have tailwinds and things about being, hey, you can build a pipeline. Not easy, but you can build infrastructure. And if you think that the last 4 years have not been good for you, I can tell you that every world leader, every CEO, even quietly and vocally, will tell you the biggest thing they're impacting, and I'm talking about outside of oil and gas, it's regulation. It's so much red tape in the US that they just can't do business. And the big businesses are trying, but they have lawyers and they have money and they're spending so much on it, and the small businesses can't even compete. So what you're seeing right now in the US, this is gasoline demand. So that purple line shows you gasoline demand. That red line shows you vehicle miles traveled. This is a cute chart that everybody's starting to use. I've been showing this for a couple of years now. The point I'm making here is that we did recover. That's not seasonally adjusted for vehicle miles traveled, but it's increased significantly since COVID. We dropped and we're coming back. Gasoline demand, however, has not. And so we aren't declining in gasoline demand, but we're flat. Now the IEA, or the International Energy Administration, they will tell you in Paris, the one that's kind of gone, they've become an advocacy group, the IEA, they will tell you that this is because we are transitioning and you have a lot of EVs on the road and this is what's happening. They are not properly extrapolating the fact that this is very much the economy and this is very much a spike that we had in oil prices and inflation, and the consumer just kind of pulled back. And this is where we've been stuck at this gasoline demand. If we look at gasoline demand versus diesel demand is telling a different story. Diesel demand is declining. It's soft, it's not rapidly declining, but it doesn't look great. Now part of that, if you see that spike in oil prices and then you saw gasoline demand flatline, that makes absolute sense. You had this massive spike, you had massive inflation at the grocery store, people were anxious, and so you just had this little bit of a pullback, and then we flatline there. Diesel is telling you that FedEx is not moving packages, that Amazon is not moving as many packages. I certainly am not buying as much stuff as I was 2 years ago. That is the entire country. And so you're seeing that actual in diesel demand, and that's the piece of the economy that people need to be watching. Interest rates, they haven't cooled off housing. Yes, we have a pretty sticky market where people just are not buying and selling because you're locked into a low mortgage rate. I'm one of those people locked into a low mortgage rate. But even right now, if the Fed cuts rates, if you have 6% mortgage rates, that doesn't mean anything. 6% versus 7% isn't super meaningful. But what we've seen is that we haven't had a meaningful drop in housing prices. So if we do start seeing lower interest rates on housing, all you're going to do is just prop up housing again. And so this is that problem that the Fed has with pushing, inflation, rearing its head again. This is where they're at. They're kind of stuck. We have U.S. household debt kissing about $18 trillion. It's a massive amount. Now, if you put this into perspective, I heard a stat the other day on Bloomberg, and somebody was saying we actually have like 150 trillion net worth in the U.S. So in households. So it's a massive amount of net worth. It's a crap ton. And he was saying, basically we have a lot less debt. But the problem is where that debt is and what it is. And so the big chunk of that is mortgage debt. And then you have all this other debt rising, which is auto loans and student loans and credit cards. And so increasingly what you're seeing is, yes, people are still flying. People are still going to restaurants. They're buying a whole lot less of everything. And they're putting those experiences like Disneyland on their credit card. And that is not a healthy economy, and that's not something we want to promote as an economy. And we have a very large federal deficit. And people want to talk about this a lot. They want to say, right now, I'm hearing something I've never heard in the stock market. And that is that regardless of who gets into office, we are going to have high interest rates and we're going to have a high federal deficit. Now, we definitely have spent more over time, and you can see this chart. But if you were to take the line that we were on and just keep going up, it's still lower than where we're at, because this administration has spent like drunken sailors in terms of spending. This is a very aggressive administration in terms of spending. Congress is absolutely a part of that. The Inflation Reduction Act is not an Inflation Reduction Act. It's a spending bill, which is inherently inflationary. There was a woman on TV today that was basically just on this morning on Squawk Box that was saying that, renewables are deflationary. And I thought, what are you smoking? Because, it's not deflationary, and we see it in electricity bills. So the fact that you have this information, this is why it's so important to get real information into the market, is because that's what people are hearing and that's what they believe. Federal government expenditures, that's our deficit there. It's huge. Our federal deficit is 1.65 trillion, and our interest payments right now are 1 trillion, and that's just our interest payments. That is more than our current military spending. And we have big problems in the military side, where Jamie Dimon was just saying this yesterday as well. We have got to spend a lot of money on military because we have all these wars going on, and we are sending ammunition like crazy. If you want to know why Russia is visiting North Korea, it's because he's getting ammunition. He's getting old crap from a long time ago, but he's getting it. And the effectiveness of Iran with their cheap drones, sending them to Russia, the effectiveness that they've had within the Red Sea, they are doing a lot of things very cheap and very, very effectively. And the US has forgotten this thing called deterrence, peace through strength, and we're not doing it anymore. And now we have wars rampant. All of that is inflationary. All of that is inherently inflationary. So if we look at this and we think about this, this is your money chart. If you take away nothing from this presentation, this is one of the charts that you should take away. That's oil prices in green. That is interest rates in black there, and you can see interest rates flatlined. I would love to tell Jerome Powell that he should just look at this chart, because when he stopped raising interest rates, inflation stopped coming down. And people say, well, we had this little tick down yesterday, and that's where it's reflective of that orange line, but you have unemployment creeping up. And that's definitely something the Fed, given they are doves, this is statistically, the folks running the Federal Reserve are doves. They're not hawkish. They are not as concerned about, they're okay with running the economy a little hot. They're more concerned about unemployment. When unemployment starts to tick up, it is very hard to curb it. So when it starts to go, basically the consumer does not lead a recession, but I really do think in this one, the consumer may be a big part of that recession, because as the consumer starts pulling back from Lululemon to Coca-Cola, oh my gosh, people were talking on the market yesterday about chips, that the fact that a bag of Doritos is like $6.50, and that people are not buying it. They're basically telling their kids, no, we're not getting that, because it's $6.50. And it used to be a few years ago, $3.50. That's huge. So when they're pulling back, all it takes is a cascading effect of everyone to pull back a little bit, and that's when you start seeing layoffs. So if we take this back 20 years, you'll see that we had 2 bouts of high oil prices, and we did not have high inflation. That is a really, really big one here. We now have high oil prices and we have high inflation. So as oil prices tick up or get back, push that, into the mid 80s or 90s, this is a problem for the consumer, and this is why the administration is working with Saudi Arabia. They're trying to get Saudi Arabia to throw another 1 million barrels a day on the market. Saudi doesn't really want to do that, but they might. But it would throw chaos into the oil market. But that is definitely what the administration is trying to do, and they're going to release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So yes, we have $83 WTI, but we're going to have some chaos before the election. Interest rates, inflation, unemployment, you can see that clearly. You can basically see that unemployment lags the interest rates and inflation. This is different. We have a unique post-COVID period where you have a lot of people that simply the world of working is a lot different. I live, eat, and breathe my job, and I love it. And I'm deeply passionate. And the only way I can be as good as I am is to live, eat, and breathe it and do it all the time. But wow, when you meet young people, they do not have that same conviction about work. And a lot of people have left the workforce, and we have this stickiness and this weirdness, and this is what we're seeing. And partly what you're really seeing in the inflation data also is the service side, is the fact that services, the piece of inflation is high. And so that's what the Biden administration gets on TV and says, okay, well, all these people in services, all these jobs we've added, they just re-added them. They didn't add them. They just shut the economy and they opened it back up and jobs came back. those service jobs, and I'm not knocking those, there's wonderful people in this hotel working, they're getting more money, but they're not getting enough to pay the grocery store bills. They're not getting enough to pay the rent. They're not getting enough to pay the utility bills, and they're not making enough money to feel good about the economy. And that is what is showing up in the polls, or showing up in elections around the world. So shelter and service inflation, we still have this above 5%. I think that's really important to notice. This is updated data. So even with what the CPI that came in a little less than hotter than expected yesterday, you still have those both above 5%, and that's shelter inflation, or that service inflation in yellow that's hard to see, that is still very, very sticky, and well north of 5%. It's still above 5%. U.S. electricity inflation. I can't bang the drum on this one enough. U.S. electricity inflation came down. The actual percentage came down a little bit last month, this month. The previous month was 5.9%. But the actual electricity prices are going one direction, and you can see that massive uptick. That is absolutely, the Biden administration can take credit for a lot of things, and this is one of them. Electricity prices are damn high. You went from 14 cents a kilowatt hour to 18 cents a kilowatt hour, and this is because every utility company in the world drank the Kool-Aid. In all these states like Colorado, and they're all pushing renewables into the grid like crazy. They're passing the cost of those renewables onto the consumer. They're passing the cost of decommissioning those coal-fired power plants onto the consumer, and they're shoving these crappy renewables into the grid and passing that cost onto the consumer. So when Joe Kernan asked the woman today if renewables were, he said, how can they be disinflationary? And she said, well, they just are. And I thought, this is not true. And this has barely started. We've barely started doing it, and this is the result we're getting. So half your grid, I just simplified this, but half your grid is natural gas, half, which means when we saw 3 months of $1 and change nat gas prices, the consumer should have been feeling really good. They should have got deflation. They should have been seeing their utility bills go down, but they weren't. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that when you shove wind and solar into a grid at the pace we have, the correlation is strong. Wind and solar into a grid equals higher household utility prices. That's guaranteed. Also, when you've taken that coal and you've taken it down, and you actually have leaders in the natural gas industry, and thank God that Toby Rice said this. He leads on natural gas, and he's the one that will come out here and tell you, hey, the reason we have you have spikes in your utility bills is because you've decommissioned that coal-fired power generation, and now natural gas doesn't work the way it did. Now you can't enjoy all the benefits of natural gas because you get those price spikes. So what the answer is that we need a lot more natural gas production, but we need infrastructure. We need to be exporting natural gas, and we need to have a much more fluid market in the U.S. on natural gas, which means every molecule that we export, we're lowering the price of natural gas abroad. We're making it easier for countries to get it, but we're also making it more stable in the U.S., and we're giving a base price for U.S. producers. So it's a win-win for everyone. That's very China, win-win-win. We could do some of those. So wind and solar power generation, that's just you see it, I just charted it for you. That's wind and solar into the grid, and that's electricity prices. It's a pretty clean correlation. JP Morgan does an excellent job in their annual energy report. They show this correlation in Europe. When you put wind and solar into the grid, you increase electricity prices. We see this in Colorado. I won't beat the drum on this. We've seen massive increases and approvals from the Colorado Public Utility Commission that's saying that they can go ahead and do it. That AI demand, it's very real, and it's happening. I think there's some questions in terms of how long it lasts. If we had a downturn in the economy, what would this look like? But the point is that you do have so much demand, and none of these tech firms are saying we're doing it with wind and solar. Certainly, you might drive to one of them and you might see some wind and solar around there, but they are not banking on wind and solar driving this. They are going to be using natural gas, they're going to be using diesel backup because they are smart and they know that they can't afford for it to go out. So that's what there's some real concerns that for the first time in a long time, we are going to actually have to start building out our grid. Now, you would have thought we were going to do that because the Greenies wanted to electrify everything and add all that into the grid. That means you would have to build out your grid. Turns out that it's very, very hard in the US to actually build out transmission lines and get anything done, whether it's a wind facility, a solar facility, or an oil and gas facility. They all face very similar headwinds. And so getting things built is very, very difficult. Now, just put this in perspective, that's US CO2 emissions. And the reason I chart that next to, that's our power generation. So you can see that coal declined. It's basically a perfect correlation with US CO2 emissions. Coal declined, natural gas came up, and those renewables came up. And I would argue that I think if we did not have those renewables, we would be running much more efficiently with coal and natural gas, and we would probably actually have lower CO2 emissions. Globally, and this is so, so important, is that globally, traditional energy, and I do not call them fossil fuels, I call it traditional energy. It is oil, natural gas, and it's coal. That is 82% of primary energy consumption as of 2022. So 7% of renewables, including wind, solar, and biomass, only 7% as of 2022. And so we can sit here and we can argue about what should we talk about, should we be discussing that, but the reality is that you have to have the information in the marketplace because it's literally not there. So someone has to be talking about this and giving a platform to where companies can actually talk about their businesses and they can be evaluated appropriately. Global CO2 emissions, they are still on the rise because that's apparently what we all care about the most. There are other big things happening around the world, but when we're talking about CO2, this is what it looks like. You have China here as the top emitter. The next largest emitter is us, the US. We're on that little bit of a decline. Then you have all of Europe, and then you have India along with China on the rise. Coal is very much entrenched in the Chinese economy, very similar to the way it's entrenched in the Indian economy. But for China, this is about energy security. They are not going to make any changes. And so that is our grid. We have 4,500 terawatt hours in our total grid. China has double that. They have 9,000 terawatt hours, and 5,400 of those come from coal. We don't even have 1,000 in coal. So when we're trying to decommission our coal-fired power plants and we're trying to put people out of business and we're trying to take good-paying jobs from people, and we're trying to the plans for Craig, Colorado and Hayden, they're going to take out those coal-fired power plants and the coal mine. They do not have plans for actually replacing that power, but they're going to do it, and they want to feel they get to lay in their bed in Denver and they get to feel really good about it. But all the people in Northwest Colorado and the people that get that power, they don't feel very good about, and they shouldn't, because this is absolutely wrong, and it makes not a lick on global CO2 emissions. And the pushback and the education needs to be now, and it needs to be hard and fast, because that is China, that's their CO2 emissions, and that's the U.S. So natural gas has done that. You're welcome. China versus US, the biggest thing is GDP. So if we chart emissions in GDP, the US is the only country in the world that's actually able to lower emissions and increase GDP. And that's super meaningful because it comes from low cost power generation. And natural gas is an energy dense fuel, and we can't underscore that enough of what it can actually do, and that's what it's doing. Now the White House, I just have to show this because I think it's hilarious. So those are solar panels. This is on the White House website, so I'm not being biased here. You can just pull this up. So if you're trying to see what the White House is doing, go on the White House website. This is their clean energy page, and that's a piece of paper. You'll notice there's nothing on it. It's just a blank piece of paper. You have one guy looking at the camera. You have two people like pretending to look at this blank map. And that is literally perfect embodiment of the Biden administration energy policy, which is just a blank piece of paper. The record, and this is so relevant, I was putting these together and I gave a keynote in Boston a few weeks ago, and this is before all the stuff came out with the election, or the debacle with the debate. But the record, and this is really, really important because you keep hearing this on the stock market, you keep hearing this on TV, is that the Biden administration is not winning the narrative war on the economy. I don't feel great about the economy because I feel that inflation all the time. But you have the Biden administration and you have all these people getting on the stock market and TV saying, oh we're doing so much better, we have lowered costs for everyone. And they say this, so they put this on the website saying they're lowering costs for everyday families through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a massive spending bill, which is inherently not disinflationary. So they just have this messaging wrong because no matter how much you get on TV and say that you're doing well, that's not what people feel. And that just really shows they're completely out of touch with reality, completely out of touch with the average person, which has less to do with politics and just more to do with humans. And so the SPR, this is right out of the White House. They are basically saying that we will do everything we can to make sure the market is supplied well enough to ensure as low a price as possible for American consumers. They are guaranteeing that you're going to drain the SPR before the election. They've already drained it, added a smidgen. This kind of puts a floor on oil prices a little bit because there's an expectation that someone will need to refill this. The Biden administration, do not look to them. If we have another 4 years of the Biden administration, they will drain this SPR. They will not fill it back up, and they will do a hell of a lot more on federal lands that they've already done in terms of not being able to have a lease sale. So expect that to increase because they are not going to have another re-election. So they're going to do everything they can, and it is not going to be pro-oil and gas, which means it's going to be very, very expensive for the U.S. and consumers. So we already talked about this, where's deterrence? I think this relationship between Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran, just pay attention to it. It is really, really serious. I don't have time to give you my 20,000 word dissertation on China. I would love to. There's a lot going on with China and energy. They produce these wind turbines, these solar panels, these batteries, and that's one thing. But they can produce a lot more than just wind turbines and solar panels and batteries in this massive industrial sector that they have. And they are absolutely supporting the Russia's war efforts, like directly and indirectly. We saw that on in the reason Biden had a press conference yesterday was because it was a NATO press conference. No one was tuning in because it was about NATO. They were tuning in to see his capability to answer questions. But that's actually why he was doing it, is because NATO had come out and said, hey, China is supporting this war effort, and that's a problem. We trade about $500 to $600 to $700 billion with China. Everybody says we have to keep being friends with them because we have to continue that. Look, the trade, it was a lot less with Russia, but that ended. And that ended because they invaded Ukraine, and then we don't do business with them anymore. So if you've got assets in China, I encourage you to get them out. Because no matter what, I mean, Stanley Druckenmiller says this on TV. He's a multi-billionaire, and he said something awesome on Squawk Box several weeks ago. He said, they asked him about China, and he said, we have been out of China for 10 years because he just didn't believe it was a good market. And he said, but as an American, I feel really good about that. And that is okay, and we need leadership like that to actually speak truth to what the hell is happening in the world. So Iran, we have all this funding we'll go through, but Russia's war in Ukraine, that's what the map looked like the day it happened, the one on the left. That's what the map looks like right now. So yes, they haven't consolidated as much as they wanted in the north, but they've really consolidated this stuff on the side. And what happened when the West was not funding Ukraine, and there's a lot of messiness with that, but when the West wasn't funding Ukraine, Russia definitely took advantage of that, and they were able to knock out a lot of their power generation, a lot of their energy facilities. And so essentially, it's all about missile interception. So if Russia's throwing stuff at a power plant, if a couple of those hit, it's going to do enough damage that it knocks out that power plant. The whole reason they were attacking energy infrastructure in the beginning, and the whole reason they're attacking energy infrastructure now, is so that Ukraine can't actually rebuild itself, so it can't build up its missile defense system. So if people, like, energy is at the heart of almost every war because it's the heart of people's everyday lives. So expect this to continue to be a going problem. There is no end in sight to this war right now, and it's draining a lot of coffers, both on the Ukrainian side, on the Russian side, and it's going to continue for a long time. The Israeli-Hamas war, we are 10 months into this very, very, the media has a stance to say on this. If you followed what actually happened on October 7th, you would appreciate why it's still ongoing. Right now, Israel is being hit on the north from Hezbollah out of Lebanon. They're still being attacked they're still fighting with Hamas. And there's basically a lot of question marks here. This got probably more volatile and more interesting for Blinken and his staff that is continually over, the White House staff that's continually over in Israel continually, because there's a lot of question marks on the Biden administration. He did talk about that yesterday, and he was very supportive of Israel, but there's no clarity, and people, I don't think, are completely sure if he's calling the shots. So we have all this war, we have all this volatility, and I don't want to downplay what happened in Israel. The stuff that happened was incredibly vicious, and the reason it was so vicious was because Hamas wanted the world to hate Israel, and they got exactly what they wanted. They have the world hating Israel, and all Israel's trying to do is defend itself, and that's what we have. But we have oil going from Iran to China, and we have money going from China to Iran. We have Russia sending oil to India. Narendra Modi was just reelected, not with a big sweep that people thought, but he's now actually in Russia visiting with Putin. So we have a lot of problems here with a lot of these actors that we want to actually be our friends. We have weapons and military stuff from North Korea going to Russia. We have drones and military equipment from Iran going to Russia. So you definitely can see this sort of axis of evil is more real than you probably see in the newspapers. Russia sending crude oil, a lot of grain, a lot of coal to China, massive stockpiling. The stockpiling that China is doing on this stuff is really, really serious. And you have they have an incredible war footing right now, meaning that their economy is kind of supported by what they're doing for Russia. So I have been very down on the Chinese economy, and I still am, but they have offset a lot of stuff in their property sector by selling all this crappy green tech, but also because they're producing all this tech and all these autos and everything that they're sending to Russia, and that's helping keep their economy afloat. And they're also giving them a lot of money, and they're making this work. And Europe is just hanging out there, they're buying all this green tech from China, and they're just sending China all this money, and then we just have this nice vicious cycle. Saudi's been pretty silent. And so we went through all this. I'm going to keep going through it. Okay, you have Iran sending at least probably 2 million barrels a day to China. If you put an $80 price tag on that, that's about almost $5 billion a month. You actually see that in the data where their exports have increased and their revenue has increased. So it gives Iran a lot of wiggle room to fund all these proxy organizations. You have to pull the money away, which means you would be having to put sanctions on Iran. You could go to the US and say, what can we do to increase output? Could we increase output 500,000 barrels a day, 600,000 barrels a day? Could we sanction Iran for that amount? That is possible. We could build Keystone XL. There's a lot of different things we could do from an infrastructure standpoint to eke a little bit more out, but that's not what this administration is going to do. When we think about the actual Red Sea, the ships that are attacked within the Red Sea, that's ongoing. You don't hear about it as much because everybody's talking about the elections and everybody's talking about Biden's scoffs. and everybody's just talking about what's happening in the news that day. But you still have these ships being attacked in the Red Sea on an ongoing basis, and that means that all these ships are moving around. You have more than 20% of global container ships actually go through the Red Sea. So that's at least 20% of traffic that's impacted. And you have at least 10% of oil that went through. So all that's being impacted. And the longer your ship is on the water, the higher the cost, the more fuel you're using, the pressure on oil prices goes up. China is absolutely, as I mentioned, at the heart of all this funding. That's just a map to put into perspective. Everybody thinks China, the debate on when China wants Taiwan, they definitely want Taiwan. You can read from Mao to Deng Xiaoping to Hu Jintao. So you can read every leader. They only had 5 since, we've had 5 leaders, Mao to now. And there's a continuity. They all want Taiwan. But Taiwan is more strategic than just getting it, right? They're right in the middle here. And so China's kind of hemmed in. There's a reason they want Taiwan. It's because it hems them in. Their 9-dash line, which they say they just added a 10th and they kind of swooped it right around Taiwan. That's all really real. Whether or not they will do anything in the near term, I think they could probably do more than we think with Russia and with other entities, with saber rattling from North Korea, with Russia getting a little more involved. They could probably do more, and you should think about that more like short term. They're not wanting a long protracted war. And they don't actually want war. They just want to basically make a lot of pain for Taiwan and for the U.S. and the West to say, oh my gosh, just take it because the economic hit to us is so much. That's what they actually want. But right now, there's a lot of actions in the Philippines. There's a little shoal that everybody's fighting over because the Philippines have a ship that's run aground that they just keep giving stockpiles and fuel and food to these people on the ship. If that ends, China is just going to take control of that, and that's what the fight is about. And so you have a lot of skirmishes, like pretty intense ones, that are happening right now in the Philippines, and you're not hearing about that because the news is just covering everything else. So I'm going to be almost over my 45 minutes. So if you're going to allow me, I'm going to go over my 45 minutes, and then you can just bug me in the break time. So the IEA says that oil demand is curbing and peaking. This was a big report that they put out a few weeks ago saying that we are going to peak oil demand within this decade. We're going to peak oil demand. And if you remember, the IEA said that we already peaked oil demand in 2019. So they continually revise this. But what they're doing now is they're using this oil demand peaking, and they're actually kind of bringing it forward into their monthly reports, which is funneled into the market. So yesterday they released a report and they said the oil demand didn't look great. I actually agree with them on that. Right now, oil demand does not look amazing, and it is curbed a little bit. But it is because of the economy. It's not because of this. And they're getting a little mixed where they're trying to pull in. They'll say in their 1-month outlook that it's the economy, but then they say, oh, it's also going to be about EVs. And they're not really right there because EVs, if you've followed EVs lately, I mean, Tesla is one thing, and we saw you have a big Tesla sales distribution right here when you come into this hotel. But Tesla is not EVs. EVs is what I'm talking about, is when Hertz loses their CEO because they've invested so heavily in EVs. The resale on EVs is absolutely atrocious. It was a bad business model for Hertz because nobody wants to actually rent an EV and have to plug it in and give it back to them. They just want to fuel up and give it back to them. So it didn't work, but the problem is the resale is so bad that it's not selling. And so when China's dumping them onto the global market and companies like Ford and GM aren't making a lot of money on them in the first place, it's just a recipe for disaster. So that's your global oil consumption. It is, we had this dip in COVID, and then that's 2022. It's still on a trajectory. We're north of 100 million barrels a day. So this is the Saudi US. How long will this last? We're producing over 13 million barrels a day. They're producing 9 million barrels a day. We are exporting more total crude and product than Saudi is. That's not a recipe for a long-term good solution. We will have to reconcile that at some point. And the answer for the U.S. industry is that you need to be resilient. You need to make sure that you can work with a lower price environment, and that means having infrastructure. That means having gas infrastructure. That means having pipelines. That means allowing higher natural gas prices to offset your margins when you have slightly low oil prices. So there's a lot of things the U.S. can do, and there's a lot of things states can do. Global LNG, this is super, super important to point out because global liquefied natural gas volumes are only a quarter of the global natural gas market. The global natural gas market is 400 billion cubic feet per day. We produce over 100 billion cubic feet per day of that market. 52 billion cubic feet per day is what goes on the water. It's not an easy process. You have to actually liquefy that. You have to send it to the country. They have to return it into gas. Then they have to put it in pipeline. The reason coal is so attractive for China and Asia is because they don't have to do all this stuff. They can put it on a ship, they can put it in a container, they can put it on a truck, they can rail it, they can barge it. It's much more energy secure. It's not as good from a CO2 emission standpoint and not as good from a pollution standpoint, but it works and it's secure. But the point of this LNG thing is that when the Biden administration put that pause in, they put a lot of chaos into the global market. I mean, you heard it if you were following what was going on in Europe, if you were following what was going on in Asia, they actually vocalized this. It was really, really serious. And they have now signed long-term contracts with Qatar and Australia. And so it's going to get produced somewhere, and the world is just bifurcating where the global north and the global south are just completely split. So it's basically the US and the West and Europe are pushing the energy transition and moving away, and they're consuming this stuff, and the rest of the world is just going to consume it. So you are absolutely not going to lower CO2 emissions. You're probably going to increase them. But that's why that's a big deal. That's global gas consumption. That's coal. It's very strong. European manufacturing, not good. European data, economic data, overall is just not good. We've seen a decline in global trade. Europe does not demand a whole lot of crude oil. I mean, collectively they do. It's about 14 million barrels a day, but it's been kind of on a steady, slow downward decline because their economy is declining. Watch that closely. Expect that to decline a little bit more, but Germany is your bellwether. They are the sick man of Europe. They have a massive amount of red tape, and that's partly this pushback we're seeing with the incumbent getting knocked out with elections. This is China's EVs that they're, adding, the fact that they're adding dead companies, they're reviving dead companies to add more electric vehicles that the world doesn't even want, just tells you that this isn't simply supply and demand. This is not about basic economics. This is how China works and what they're actually doing. That's the crude oil that they're importing according to the EIA. They're importing this much crude oil. Whether or not they're using this much crude oil is a big question. They're stockpiling a lot of this. And the economy, we know they're stockpiling a lot of it because it's just not supportive of the economy. We have a downward price in home prices, which are just cratering on that side. And you can actually just look at cement output. And no Chinese data should be taken, you take that home and take it to the bank. But the fact that you're declining at all with cement output is a really big deal. And I talk about the Chinese economy. It was never real. You never had 20% GDP growth. Not the way we think about GDP. When I say GDP, I'm talking about rebar and cement, and you stick it to it, and that you take it home, and you actually have an economy. In China, you build a bridge, and nobody may drive over it. When you drive over the bridge, when you build a bridge and you drive over it and you connect economies and societies, that actually adds to GDP over the long term. That's not what happens in China, and that's why it's kind of fake and messy. And you actually see this in EV, solar and battery, the fact that they had nothing. It was $2 billion, and now it's $14 billion in exports. That is massive, and that is something people have to really, really think about. When you are not friends with this country and you are adopting what they're selling you like crazy, there are ramifications for this, and they are long, and we don't have time to go through them. Chinese gold reserves are way, way up. Their trade with Russia is also way, way up. These are all scary things. So I am still over time. I'm going to go through U.S. shale really fast. Are we okay doing that? Okay, awesome. All right, 13.2 million barrels a day. We have over 100 BCF a day, 124 BCF a day in nat gas. We have a massive amount of production resiliency regardless of price. And this sounds simple, but just look at this chart. Look at where oil prices were and look at the trajectory of production. Yes, we came down within COVID, but really we just went up. And states like New Mexico are a huge, huge part of that. So I would love to get into the weeds on the San Juan and the Delaware and the differences. All amazing basins. The majority of production, though, as you know, is coming from the Delaware Basin. You're producing 2 million barrels a day in the state, largely from 2 counties. I can't tell you how much I go around the world telling people that 2 counties in New Mexico are producing 2 million barrels a day. That is more than many OPEC countries. It's just an insane amount. I mean, it's an insane amount of oil production, but it's incredible rock. And it's something that the market does not know that. And most of the time, people actually think that you don't have a problem with regulations in New Mexico because you have so much production. You also have a lot of gas production, and that does need to be addressed because you need to get that gas out. Obviously less from the San Juan, but that's meaningful because you're producing it, and it is really looking quite nice right now, but you have to actually get that to a market, which means you have to have infrastructure. That's just perspective of those small OPEC countries. You are outperforming several of them like crazy, including more than double of Venezuela. We don't want to be California, Alaska, and Colorado's on that trajectory. That's Colorado production on the right where it's kind of flatlined. We defeated Proposition 112 with major setbacks in 2018, but when Jared Polis was elected, he had an agenda, and it was definitely not friendly to the Oil and Gas Administration. SB 181 was passed, and it's been hell to get a permit now in Colorado. You can get them, but it's not easy, and so you have production that's kind of wonky, but it's still 500,000 barrels per day in one county, in Weld County alone. California and Alaska, they are in terminal decline because you simply can't get anything done in those states, and California is very anti-oil and gas. Alaska's not, but they can't get anything done because the Fed won't allow them to. The reason we have such a low rig count right now, we're under 600 rigs, and yet we're producing 13.2 million barrels a day. That's very, very hard for a lot of folks to understand. It has a lot to do with that lateral length, that yellow line on there, the fact that the average lateral length is over 10,000 feet on average. So I walked to the stables yesterday, and I was just thinking, that's a 1.5 mile walk. And we're looking at laterals continually, double that, at least 3 miles, 4 mile long laterals that we are drilling all the way out 4 miles, and we are fracking the toe of that well, and we are getting production out of it. That is a massive, incredible technological feat that a lot of folks, including within the industry, didn't think we could do just a handful of years ago. And so those incremental moves really, really add up, and we see that actually in the production data. The lateral lengths that we see in the Delaware and Midland are just phenomenal. We have more room to grow in the Delaware, but certainly in the Midland, you're well north of 11,000 feet, looking at 12,000. We're exporting a crap ton of product, refined product, crude, NGLs. It's nearly 11 million barrels per day. A couple months ago, it was over 11 million barrels per day of crude and refined product, over 2 million barrels a day of propane alone. That's just incredible. The impact to the countries who use this, Jared was talking about that the other night, the impact to the countries who actually use this propane, it is a meaningful contribution. It's also a meaningful contribution to our economy. Part of the reason we are not in recession is because we produce 13.2 million barrels a day. We get a lot of that revenue, and we're not sending that abroad in terms of money, and we're getting that revenue, and we have a lot of employment. That's LNG, we're exporting a lot of that. That's your rigs, your public and private rig split. So you can see that publics, really after COVID, they were very, very slow to take off. And I'm almost done, so just bear with me. Then you saw privates really come back in earnest. That's what a lot of companies in this room did, a lot of amazing things as private companies. And then you've had this recent move where the privates have dropped the rigs because they're very uncertain despite very high oil prices. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and publics have come back a little bit. That's where you see it. That's the public and private, the rigs currently where they stand. And so what you see is that the publics are all in the core, and everybody talks about the core and the tier 1 acreage. And then you see the privates outside of the core, and they're drilling and producing, and they're doing awesome things. They're also making great money. And so I call BS on the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 acreage. We have a lot of acreage, and the privates usually prove that up. Right now, that's what it looks like in New Mexico. You have a lot of public operators, so that's half the problem. You have a lot of companies that you can see those names. You guys know them well. Not half the problem, I'm going to say that, but you have a lot of concentration of assets in a few hands. That's your horizontal completions for the US, and I am almost done. That's stacked up. So that's those bars or how many wells that you've added. We have not come back to our pre-COVID levels, and yet we're producing way more than we were pre-COVID. That's part of that lateral length. That's part of that productivity. And your private companies really took the charge, right? Private companies came back, they added wells, public companies did not. And so it really tells you that despite all the privates stepping out of the core, they're maintaining productivity. And that's such an impressive story, and it's one that the market really does not understand. That's your Permian Basin horizontal completions. That did come back to the races. That also shows you WTI and the rig count corresponding, but they did come back to the races. You are adding more wells in the Permian than you were pre-COVID, and privates have a lot to do with that. They're adding way more wells than they were pre-COVID, but publics have come back as well. And last slide, this is your decline curve. This is your productivity. This is every single basin in the US that produces oil and gas. And the fact that we have stepped out, the fact that we're doing 3 mile long laterals, the fact that we have far less rigs, the fact that our dotted line is where we're at for productivity and our productivity curve has not been smashed is just incredible. And that is why we're producing 13.2 million barrels a day. So on that, I'm going to stop. Thank you guys.